new edition of the Space Policy Show. My name is Jordan Bingham, and I'll be your new host. Today's episode is Fishing with Satellites: Illegal, Unreported, and Unregulated. Space based capabilities have provided an enormous amount of data that track climate and environmental changes. Aerospace's Center for Space Policy and Strategy is proud to highlight this intersection of space and better stewardship of the environment. Find out more at csps.aerospace.org. In today's episode, we talk about fishing from space, how satellite data has shed light on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing activity, as well as the challenges that remain. William Cromarty is from Spire Global, where he leads partnerships with federal civil agencies on matters of aviation and maritime tracking. Dr. Dee Pack is director of Aerospace's Remote Sensing Lab. He has an extensive background in space applications and CubeSat programs. Our host, Carrie Faye Reinert, just completed her internship with Aerospace's Center for Space Policy and Strategy. Take it away, Carrie.
You know, up to 1 in 5 fish sold in the United States today is caught illegally. That's a staggering number, but many Americans may not truly know the extent of IUU fishing. IUU stands for Illegal, Unreported, and Unregulated Fishing. Today, we have some guests who are excited to share their experiences with it. So my first question for both of you is, when did you start hearing about the problem of illegal fishing? What motivated you to get involved with ocean monitoring? Will, if you'd like to answer first.
Yeah, sure. This is Will Cromarty with Spire Global. So this has been something that we've looked at for quite some time now, mainly tied into our work with Global Fishing Watch. As for me personally, I come from a counterproliferation background, and so a lot of my work previously had to do with dark vessels when I was in the federal government. And a lot of the time, the technology that's used to tackle this tends to be pretty similar for IUU fishing and also counterproliferation topics. So it's kind of a pretty natural adaptation of a lot of that technology.
Awesome. What about you, Dee?
I got involved with this issue when I was working with the NOAA VEERS day-night band sensor. And after that launched, the higher resolution night lights that it provided revealed the scale of global fishing in a way that had never really been seen before. And it motivated my research with small satellites to duplicate and enhance some of the nighttime human light monitoring capabilities, so we could look at all types of lights at night, but including global fishing.
Oh, awesome. To what is the extent of illegal fishing in your opinion? What about that particular experience opened your eyes?
Well, it was the revealing by the VEERS sensor of these really vast areas that were populated by fishing boats and their lights that were essentially fish attractors. And the Eastern Pacific in particular looked like there were literally floating cities in the sea comprised of these commercial fleets.
Will, on that note, how does Spire see illegal fishing impact the planet as a whole?
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been a problem that we've been looking at for a while, and one of the key elements here is that typically you have individuals that are looking at singular data sets, and so by combining those data sets and having multiple sources of information, we really feel like we've been able to make a big impact there with partners like Global Fishing Watch. It's typically taking a look at not only that AIS data that we're collecting, but then marrying that up with other remote sensing capabilities, sometimes even synthetic aperture radar or additional signals, to really get an extent of what those fishing fleets are doing, and also when they're violating the EEZs of certain nations.
Dee, Will just listed off a bunch of different types of data that can be used for marine monitoring. What types of data have you worked with in your past experience? And can you break some of them down for our audience here at Aerospace?
Well, the types of data you can bring to bear are, as Will states, the signals, such as those collected by Spire, from AIS and related shipborne signals, synthetic aperture radar, which can see through clouds, standard electro-optical systems, such as those flown by Planet using CubeSats. Those, while largely directed at land resources, have started to look at shipping, especially port counting for economic reasons. And then the sensors I've worked with primarily have been the lights at night sensors, the day-night band from NOAA's VIIRS sensor that flies on two polar orbiting weather satellites, and then CubeSat sensors that the Aerospace Corporation has launched into space, initially very simple cameras, but cameras that successfully were able to see the great fishing fleets of the Eastern Pacific. And then as we designed more capable sensors, such as the night vision cameras that flew on the Cumulus sensor on the JPL NASA ISARA mission, we really started to see a higher resolution than the 740 meter type pixels that VIIR provides. We started getting down towards 100 meters, and you could see resolved lights from shipping in these densely packed areas, be they heavily fished areas in the Eastern Pacific, or essentially ship parking lots off the coast of the UAE where the oil tankers cluster. So by studying new types of technology that can be fused, you can get a clearer picture across these different phenomenologies of what's going on in the oceans.
All right. With those different types of data in mind, Will, I'm curious to hear your perspective. Over time, how have you seen the role that space-based capabilities currently play? How have you seen that role of relying on space-based assets evolve from, some of the earlier days of Spire to the current days? I know you've been working with Spire for the past few years, but, have you heard from coworkers more about this evolution of reliance on space-based capabilities?
Yeah, and I think space-based capabilities have really proven to be invaluable on a lot of this. You figure, especially once any vessel gets about 40 miles offshore, functionally they're a dark vessel unless you are collecting from space. Because once you get away from those terrestrial networks, which kind of have their own limited distance for AIS, at a certain point, you're going to need other capabilities to bring in, and space-based really tends to fill in a lot of those gaps. I think in an IUU context, especially, I've seen the more we've launched these satellites, the more really deep insight we've had into a lot of the regions where IUU fishing can be the worst. So, if you think about Alaska and the Arctic and a lot of the locations like that, where, you might have remote regions that are supposed to be ecologically protected, space-based capabilities have really filled in the gaps there. And it's been a lot of fun to watch.
Dee, I'm curious, we're talking about, two different efforts to develop these particular technologies. How do you think that we can integrate different data sets into a more complete picture of these parking lots of dark vessels?
Yeah, well, first I'd like to echo something that Will said, which is, in the remote regions, such as even the waters off the coast of Antarctica now, you're seeing exploitation of pelagic fish that we've never seen before. So, space is the only game for some of these monitoring missions, and integrating the data together is a big task, and especially when you're dealing with disparate data sets. But organizations like Global Fishing Watch have proven that you can do it with VIIRS and with coastal AIS. So using that as a starting point, it seems reasonable to bring in the other space-based phenomenologies, starting with signals and the night lights, and then as new, perhaps commercial, perhaps governmental, higher resolution nightlight sensors, such as the ones demonstrated by Aerospace in some of its CubeSats, come online. Those could be integrated by these NGOs or by commercial data aggregators who make it their business to do this for a living. And it's an exciting time to be in space now. Satellites are getting smaller but more capable, and there's constellation-sized capabilities going up that can do things we've never been able to do before. So it's really an exciting time to be in the space business and in the data aggregation business, and in the global monitoring business as we start really trying to quantify global climate change and the various ramifications of it. And I think, pressure on global fishing stocks is one of those.
Yeah, Will, do you have any, I guess, anything to say in response to that or to add on?
Yeah, sure. One additional thing that I would add on also that we found particularly useful in a lot of the dense, crowded areas. So one thing that we do is something called dynamic AIS, where we're basically using shipborne receivers to collect from other vessels around them. And so, in the context of a lot of locations like Southeast Asia, typically, where you have both IUU fishing concerns, but also very crowded areas, that's been another unique capability that we've found combines well with the satellite drive data as well.
That's interesting. What locations are you, seeing most often a need for satellite data for use of and for the purposes of accountability?
So typically it's wherever Chinese fishing vessels are. They've been known to not always follow the laws when it comes to IUU fishing. And so, that can range anywhere from, near the Galapagos in Southeast Asia to a lot of other island regions like that. But in order to get a good picture of, what they're doing both in transit and at those locations, like Dee was saying, those space-based capabilities end up being very useful for those oceanic regions.
Yeah, Dee, have you noticed any other? Is that observation consistent with some of your experience as well?
Certainly, the fishing pressure in the Eastern Pacific has been a driver. And if you look at the sheer scale of what's going on in the coastal waters of the Eastern Pacific, there's no doubt that Chinese fishing fleets are the largest. And as their coastal waters have become depleted, they've become far ranging. And so there's a growing need to, engage diplomatically with the Chinese so they can start enforcing the fishing rules. And it's really global in scope. And that's not to say there's not other aggressive fishing fleets. The other countries in East Asia in particular range far and wide in their fishing activities. But the U.S. is trying to take a lead with data sharing from systems like VEERS, in past cases funded by the State Department, USAID, in making those data available to countries in the Asian waters, countries like the Philippines and Indonesia and others. And also extending the Coast Guard's reach into the Pacific region so they can do treaty monitoring with allied nations and things of that nature. But the scope of the world's oceans is vast, and the problem of illegal and unregulated fishing is also vast. And so it's a big mission. The UN is getting involved, and I think that's a good thing. And these sharing these space-based data sources, I think, will be very important for the international response to monitoring and keeping track of what's going on in the world's oceans.
That's a great point. And with that problem contextualized, what are some of the biggest challenges that either of you have seen for addressing IUU fishing with this data? Are they primarily political or diplomatic challenges? Do you think there are more technological challenges? Are there gaps in what we need to develop to be able to bring accountability? Or are they more, economic challenges, trying to get companies involved, off the ground or to contribute to companies' development? I'm curious if your responses differ given your different experiences. So I guess, Will, would you like to answer first?
Yeah, sure. I would say it's probably all of the above. I'm sure there are challenges on every single one of those points there. Um, I know for me personally, I tend to be maybe a little more narrowly focused on some of the technological challenges, looking at how we can ensure that we're picking up every possible AIS signal, and also what to do when you have an actor that might be a bad actor that is, turning off their AIS or spoofing AIS, or even, sometimes you have the challenge of small vessels that might not even be transmitting at all. Um, so I think when I look at that sensor fusion topic there, that's where that ends up being especially critical, because we love our AIS and we're collecting that globally, but we definitely have some fantastic partners that we rely on for those external data sets, and it's really that fusion of capabilities that, from a technological perspective, I think is going to resolve the dark fishing issue.
That's interesting. Dee, what has your experience been? What do you think some of the primary challenges, of actually applying this data are, or acquiring this data, I
Well,
suppose?
we're working at Aerospace. We're always, trying to be at the cutting edge of technology and doing new things. So I think in some of these cases, for instance, trying to get some civil nightlights capabilities that supplement the governmental capabilities that VIIRS provides. Some of that problem is economic. Is there a business case to be made for launching some of these types of satellites? The Japanese government and universities have been working on small sat synthetic aperture radar with kilowatt power units on 100 kilogram class satellites, and getting a constellation of those off the ground and making those data work on this mission. It's an economic issue. I think the Japanese government is firmly behind those companies, because it is a dual use technology. It can be used for these civil missions as well as disaster response and military missions. And for the US and the Europeans, there's a similar type of motivation. How can we invest in these dual use technologies that may be looking at migration issues across the Mediterranean, as well as global fishing issues. How do governments and the UN and NGOs get together to harness technology to address these new mission areas?
Those are some great questions to raise. Who do you think that we should look to for solving some of these challenges or answering some of these questions? How can each country, put together its resources to develop the right approaches, whether that be political or technical or economic?
Well, I think I can take that first. I mean, like so many things, it's going to start with the United States. And, if we provide some leadership on this topic, and if we partner with like-minded nations towards monitoring a changing Earth, with global fishing being one of the related missions, I think we can make progress. So it's technological, it's economic, it's diplomatic, and somebody's got to take the lead on it. And if not the U.S., I don't know who else would.
Will, what's your opinion on that question? Who should we look to for solving these challenges? And how does your experience working in the commercial sector impact your answer to that question?
Yeah, so I agree entirely with what Dee just said there. So I think absolutely it'll end up being led by the United States. Fundamentally, there's a certain policy element that can only be done at a nation state level, right? In terms of the interactions at a diplomatic level. But even outside of that, I think it's going to be getting all those stakeholders in a room, starting with the U.S., pulling in the NGOs, pulling in commercial elements that have those data sets that are needed. And then also pulling in, the other nations whose EEZs are being violated, because they're understandably not happy about that either.
What are Spire's primary customers? Are they often governments like the U.S. governments?
So it's pretty wide ranging. We do commercial work and federal work. I'm currently on our federal team, where I focus on civilian agencies for us. So a lot of my work has been focused here on U.S. Coast Guard, Department of Homeland Security, NASA, NOAA. But my colleagues here also focus on, the U.S. military, the intelligence community, and then the commercial side of the house is focusing on a pretty wide range of entities as well. Everything from shipping companies to insurance companies. So it's a pretty wide range of clients here.
That is certainly a very wide range. And I'm curious, how what are some of the challenges for, being a commercial company and working, to, support the government in some of your initiatives?
I think, to a certain degree, some of it is almost cultural in the sense that, government and commercial industry and academia all have their own individual cultures. And so I think sometimes we found the most success when you have people who have kind of a hybrid background that maybe have spent time both in the commercial sector and also the government sector to be able to kind of translate the funny language that each individual type uses. And we found that to be highly effective.
Dee, what's your experience been trying to bridge the different cultures between government and academia and the commercial sector?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, technologically speaking, you can get a lot of good ideas coming out of universities and non-government agencies. Uh, and the economics of space has changed. So it is possible for commercial entities and not-for-profits to launch satellites now. And so that makes it exciting. And it allows new organizations to bring space to bear on problems of interest. So you see small companies and NGOs putting up methane monitoring satellites to try to assist with our understanding of global warming. And, it's possible that you could have the same thing happen with some of these technologies as applied to global fishing monitoring. And, companies like Spire are an exemplar of what you can do in the signals space, which, as mentioned, is multi-mission oriented. There's many things you can do with that technology. Likewise with remote sensing technology, which, take the example of Planet, they use their daytime visible sensor monitoring at very high cadences compared to Landsat. And, so disaster response and other mission spaces become open. So I see, a really a great future for addressing, some of these remote sensing accessible mission spaces by private companies and NGOs, ideally in collaboration with government and with collaborative funding from government to hit at some of these hard problems. And you see these hard problems every day as we see the weather influenced natural disasters and some of these the beginnings of these competition for resources, global migration, issues that can be addressed by space technology and give governments and NGOs and international organizations a window on the world and what's going on. So ideally, we can have a beneficial impact and try to keep things on track to be good stewards of the global commons as we move forward in this century.
That's a great phrase to keep in mind, to be stewards of the global commons. I'm curious how both of you see the commercial space industry, but particularly, the satellite monitoring industry evolving from how it is today. So what do you think the market trends are in this particular industry? What is unique and different about this market as opposed to other, emerging technology markets that we see? Will, if you want to answer first, that would be great.
Sure. So I would say one trend that I've really seen is satellites getting smaller and smaller over time. Part of that is because essentially you can pack more capability into a satellite than you used to be able to. And so I think we've seen a lot of government agencies, slowly having that realization that every satellite doesn't have to be the size of a school bus and a $50 million program, on the cheap end, right? A lot of the historical satellites were incredibly large, expensive, time-consuming. A lot of moving parts there. And it's been amazing just on this end, seeing what you can pack into a CubeSat and seeing how that answer gets, even better year over year.
I totally agree. There's been a sort of Moore's law as applied to space, where the capabilities in smaller and smaller packages is just getting more and more impressive every year. And likewise in cloud computing and data aggregation, the capabilities that commercial providers are able to bring to bear now on extremely large data sets is that's new, and um, it's evolving as we speak. And when you pull in advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning, the possibilities are really limitless. And you see small companies and big companies popping up to take part in this sort of data bonanza that is underway involving space-based sensors. And so I think it's a really rosy future for people who want to get involved in space and try to tackle some of these what you might call 21st century problems, with the fallout from climate change being one that I think about a lot. And uh, the dual use missions I think about a lot, technology that has military purposes, but can also be turned towards natural disaster mitigation and towards global monitoring for humanitarian causes, and, these sort of law enforcement type issues and treaty monitoring issues that we're going to need to really tackle if we're going to succeed in keeping our economies sustainable.
That's a great insight. And I think it leads me to my final question of tonight for both of you, which is, what could a future of global fishing transparency and accountability look like? It seems like we're well on our way to having the adequate technology to be able to, identify several of our problems. But in your opinions, what needs to be done to sort of close the gap between data and action? Either one of you can
Sure. So
answer
yeah,
first.
I can take that one to start off. Sure. So I think, to close with some good news here, I think I'm actually seeing a lot of progress in this regard, in the sense of what we talked about earlier with getting all the stakeholders in one room. I feel like, especially over the last 6 months to a year or so, I've seen much more of a push to do that and to get everyone together. The good news being that the technology already exists, whether that's VIIRS like Dee talked about, or all these other data sets that we're currently pulling down from space. So the solution functionally is already there, and now it's just a matter of getting people in the room, and I think we're very close to doing that.
Well, that's encouraging to hear from you, Will. Dee, do you have any thoughts about what needs to be done to close the gap between data and action?
Yeah, I'll echo what Will said. And what is needed is really the technologies from private industry, from governments, both U.S. and foreign, and from NGOs, to be put together, and for an enforcement mechanism also to be in place, and for diplomacy to be applied. So, stewardship of the world's oceans can be begun to be addressed. So keeping track of it is the first step. Calling out bad actors, having enforcement mechanisms and diplomacy brought to bear to improve the conduct on the high seas, and to enforce countries' economic exclusion zones as provided by treaty. I think that's what needs to happen. And certainly with the night lights data that exists now, the signals data that exists now, the synthetic aperture radar data that is beginning to be brought online, that's an excellent first approach to this issue. And then hopefully, some of the technology we've researched at the Aerospace Corporation with CubeSats and smallsats can be brought to bear in the future in the remote sensing sphere, which seems to be lagging the signal sphere a bit in the small satellite world. If that technology can be brought to bear, then more countries can get involved and they can have their own satellites and contribute them to a data pool internationally that can be brought to bear on this problem.
Dee, thank you so much for that insight. It seems like the problem of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing is certainly a multifaceted one, and we're going to need a lot of synergy from government, academia, industry, and a variety of other actors to make some progress on it. But as we've heard today, the takeaway from this is hope. In that lots of companies like Spire are developing the technologies that we're going to need to have the capability to address this problem. And this conversation is one of many that are happening across the world today about this issue and a plethora of others that impact our environment. So, with that, are there any final thoughts that either of you would like to share with our audience at Aerospace?
Sure. I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to have us here. And I would encourage anyone who's currently working on this topic, please feel free to reach out. It's definitely a collaborative group that's working on this right now. And if you have a capability that you can bring to bear here that can help solve this along with the rest of us, absolutely would love to connect.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this. And, for my own part, I'm going to think a bit more about this particular mission as I, publish our results in the scientific literature and take it to conferences like the Small Satellite Conference that we go to every year and continue to engage with, with our colleagues, with companies like Spire and others as we discuss how to bring small satellite technology and space in general to bear on these global problems.
Well, that's great to hear. Thank you so much, Dee and Will, for appearing on the Space Policy Show today and for having this great conversation. I hope that it will inspire many of our audience members to learn more about this issue and about how they can participate in a really exciting new portion of the space industry.
Thank you to Carrie, Dee, and Will. We look forward to learning more on how satellite data can be effectively used against illegal fishing. Our executive producers, Colleen Stover, and our technical director is James Liggins. Check us out on Twitter using #TheSpacePolicyShow, and be sure to browse all our shows at csps.aerospace.org. We look forward to having you tune into our next episode of The Space Policy Show.